Hello and welcome to this section of the Algebra Tutor. In this section we're going to begin to talk about polynomials. And if you're like most students, when you see the word polynomial, you immediately start to get worried about it because it's a big word. It's a word that no one's ever heard of until they start talking about algebra, and it just seems difficult. But I promise you, if you just stick with me and kind of go step by step, you'll find out that polynomials are actually not a big deal, and in fact, you've been really learning about polynomials sort of up till this point without even knowing about it. We're just going to put a label on it and start to talk about it, in the context of how you would see it in a book. And the other thing is algebra and all of math, a lot of times, a lot of the barrier is the definitions to understand what are they talking about when they say negative number. Well, now you know what negative numbers are. So now when you see polynomial, you'll know what they're talking about. It won't be such a scary deal. All right. So what I would like to do is write the word on the board because you'll probably see it in your textbook written quite a bit. Polynomial. Polynomial. Let me ask you a question. Polynomial. Now, most people don't know what a nomial is, right? But what does poly mean when you look at the beginning? Poly. Poly means many, Polygon is many-sided figure. There's many examples you can come up with poly in the beginning. It means many. So when we talk about polynomials in algebra, we're talking about expressions that have many terms, basically, more than one term. So we'll talk about and give some examples in a second. Now, before we get to do that, let me tell you that there's really three main types of polynomials that we're going to talk about in the context of this class that you'll encounter in most algebra. One of them is called a monomial. One of them is called a binomial. And the other one is called a trinomial. Trinomial. All right. So you have bicycle, starts with bi. That means two wheels. You have tricycle. That starts with tri. That has 3 wheels. And monocycle or monocycle has 1 wheel. So those prefixes should tell you what we're talking about here. Basically, monomials are going to be polynomials that just have 1 term. Binomials are going to be the polynomials that have 2 terms. And the trinomials are just going to be polynomials that have 3 terms. And what I mean by term will be very clear when we write some examples down. So these words, when you see them in textbooks, really freak students out a lot because they look so different and hard. But just look at the beginning. Polynomial means many terms, and these are just different types. One of them describes, polynomials that only have 1 term. The other one describes polynomials with 2 terms, and the other one describes polynomials with 3 terms. So it's really, honestly, not a big deal at all. These labels look difficult, but they're really not. So let me go ahead and just kind of draw a little divider here. And let me give you an example of your first polynomial. 3z squared. And you're probably looking at that and you're saying, well, this doesn't look complicated. We've been doing things with stuff like this all the time. 3z squared doesn't look any different from lots of the expressions we were dealing with in the last couple of sections. Well, that's what I was telling you. You've been kind of learning about these polynomials all the time without thinking about it. And you know what this means is 3 times the variable z times the variable z again, because z squared means z times z. So that's all this basically means. But let me ask you, what type of polynomial do you think this is? Do you think it's a monomial, binomial, or trinomial? Well, there's only 1 term here. When we say a term, we mean a grouping of things multiplied together, basically is a term. There's only 1 term here, so we call this a monomial. All right, it's a type of polynomial that only has 1 term. All right, so you'll see immediately how it's different from the following. 3x plus 7. If I give you on a test, hey, here's a polynomial, tell me what type of polynomial this is. How many terms do you think you have here? You have 1 grouping here, and you have 1 grouping here. Now this one over here, there's no x's involved. That's okay. A term in algebra, when you say a term, it means a grouping of things basically multiplied together. So these guys are multiplied together. They're kind of grouped as a term. There's nothing else here. It's multiplied by 1, but it's basically grouped by itself. And they're linked together by this plus sign. So basically terms are things that are linked together by plus or minus signs. So how many terms do you have? 2 terms. So this is a binomial. So you see this is really not a big deal. Now let me give you another example. What if you had s squared minus 23 times s plus 31? And I say, here's a polynomial. Why don't you tell me what type it is? You have to identify the terms. Here is a term linked by a minus sign to the next term, linked by a plus sign to the next term. So there's 1, 2, 3 terms here. So because there's 3 terms, this is a trinomial. So literally all you're doing is you're looking at the grouping of the terms and you're trying to figure out how many terms you have, and if you have 1 or 2 or 3 terms, we have special labels for them. All of these things are called polynomials, many terms, right? Poly. It's just that we have special names for 1, 2, or 3 terms. Now, I want to make sure you understand, you can have 4 terms, 5 terms, 6 terms, you can have 10 terms in a polynomial. All you would have is, instead of plus 31 and an ending, what about plus y to the 4th, plus z to the 9th, plus 11 times 10, or something like that. Anyway, terms that keep going and going. You can have more terms past 3, we just don't have special names for them. We don't have special name for a 4th term or a 5th term, or if there are special names, we don't commonly test you on them in Algebra 1. So it's not so important to try to memorize if there are any special terms past a trinomial so much. It's just more or less trying to get you to understand these basic terms here, which is the most common. You're going to run into trinomials constantly in algebra. You're going to run into binomials constantly in algebra. You're going to obviously run into monomials everywhere too. So it's important to know these terms. There may be terms that are defined past this, but it's really not that important to memorize. So that's why we don't present them here. So what we're going to do now is switch gears a little bit and present something else that you're almost guaranteed to be asked on an exam. What if you had 3 times x to the 4th power? 3 times x to the 4th power. And I ask you, okay, is this a monomial, binomial, trinomial? You should look at this now and say, well, this is a monomial. All right? But what if I ask you, what is the degree of this polynomial? What is the degree? The degree of a polynomial is basically the highest exponent present. So this guy would be a degree of 4 because it has an exponent of a 4 there. So it's a very simple thing. It's like, in English you have to define words before you can write paragraphs and papers. In math you have to define terms. So when you have a polynomial, the degree of the polynomial is just the largest exponent present in the whole enchilada. In this case there's only one exponent here anyway, so that's obviously has to be it. But what if you had another polynomial, negative 2x squared plus 3x to the 3rd power, and I ask you, what is the degree of this polynomial? First of all, what type of polynomial is it? Well, it's got 2 terms, so it's a binomial. Okay? What is the degree? Well, you just look through and you find what is the largest exponent. The largest exponent is a 3, so the degree of this polynomial is a 3. All right? It's very simple to do. This is not really hard at all. It's just a definition that, is very simple, but if you don't know what they're talking about, you won't understand. What if I give you something a little more complicated? 3 times x squared times y cubed plus 5 times x cubed times y to the 5th. And I say, well, is this monomial, binomial, or what? And you look at it and say, well, it's binomial. It's got 2 terms. Okay? These are all multiplied together. These are all multiplied together, so there's 2 terms. What is the degree of this binomial? And now you get confused, or at least not so confused really, but what you probably do is look and you say, well, I've got a 5, I've got a 3, I've got a 3 and a 2. So most students will say the degree of this is 5. But in terms of algebra, what happens, what you really do here is if you have more than one exponent in a term, you just add them together. And for this one, you just add these together, so this will be an 8. So sort of like the degree of this term is 5, and the degree of this term is 8, and you just pick the larger one. So really the degree is 8. So bottom line is when you're trying to figure out what the degree of a polynomial is, you just look for the larger exponent. See, in this case there's only one to choose from, so it was easy. In this case there was only one exponent in either term, so we just choose the bigger one. If you have multiple exponents in the terms, you just add them all together and then you choose the larger number that you have present, and that's going to be the degree of that polynomial.